When it comes to conquering subconsciouses, 3 words, well, 5 words are important. But let's start with the first 2. Those are repetition and association. Now, there is a lot of conflict that happens specifically around these 2 concepts. Bruce Lee explained repetition through the superior use of tactics in martial arts. When you have 2 opponents of equal ability, at least in technique, it comes down to who has the superior use of tactics. And Bruce Lee states in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, a book that was allegedly written by him, similar to The Art of War, but specifically related to martial arts. Of course, martial art means art of war. So, it's interesting. But he stated that in order to gain an advantage over an opponent of equal ability, a good way to do this would be establish the repetition in their subconscious specifically through repeated series of strikes. And you repeat these strikes through tempo and cadence and whatnot, and establishes a pattern in the subconscious of the opponent. And the pattern is in reaction. So they will react to each repeated strike in the same way. And you establish a pattern of reaction in the opponent. Of course, if they catch on to this, you might not be able to do it. Otherwise, once established, the pattern of repetition will respond to cadence and tempo. And once you change the pattern, you can catch an opponent because their subconscious will instigate a reaction from the body to the original strike. But since the technique was changed, their reaction will not be applicable. And in a more basic example, if you can imagine 2 boxers, one boxer punches with one arm continuously, let's say 5 times, and the other boxer begins to block each time this same strike from the one arm. And then that boxer, instead of striking with the one arm, say the left, strikes with the right. And the other boxer will be blocking for a left side strike, but instead will take the attack from the other side, which could end up knocking him out. And that's how you catch an opponent of equal skill, at least through the establishment of the repetition tactic that Bruce Lee described. Now, the school system also practices this concept of repetition, and this is through the repetition of evaluations, mostly arbitrary, but there are other tactics that are associated here, but right now we're only looking at the tactic of repetition. Another tactic that demonstrates repetition is the filling out of paperwork. Every single place you go, you always have to fill out paperwork. And oftentimes the paperwork gets changed by an administrator or simply thrown in the wastebasket or the trash. Which means that it is entirely a tactic to establish the idea of repetition. And this similar idea was explained through the concept of spies, where a spy will come up and ask you to do a specific task with no other purpose than to establish the repeated pattern or habit of responding to direction. And it could be an easily simple tactic such as providing change for a bill, whereas that person might not actually require change, but the purpose is to get the response of direction. This is also a tactic that is listed in the concepts of pickup artists, where with the most basic example of a guy attempting to pick up a girl at a bar, will establish a pattern of simple direction and essentially control over that woman. And of course it does not, this is a tactic that any free-thinking individual can adopt and use, and then use against others, free-thinking or otherwise. And then they, catching on to this tactic, might reverse it or whatnot, but anyway, these are just simple and basic tactics and concepts to understand that mostly today appear to be used by only one side, and that, of course, is the school system, the bureaucracy, government officials, and all these other people that seek to bind us to them as their puppets. And they do this through repetition, primarily. A second thing that's used, specifically in the school system, is the tactic of association. And this is something that we can really find embedded into dictionaries. Now, in school, they specifically misassociate with the purpose of controlling thought through habit and pattern. All of this has to do with the subconscious and habits and patterns. It is extremely difficult to change a habit, and one has to be conscious of a habit they have in order to change it. They also have to be aware that it's a bad habit, and that will change depending on each person. For me, going to school and establishing a habit of going to school is far more damaging and destructive than, say, a habit of drinking alcohol. Because with a habit of drinking alcohol, the simple habit of drinking alcohol, you're only putting one poison in your body. But with a habit of going to school, you end up opening yourself up to other habits of putting multiple poisons in your body. And not only that, you'll be opening up yourself to the habit of thinking that those poisons are actually good for you, such as with all of the drugs and other things that people constantly put in their body despite all the endless warnings of all the side effects and whatnot. And that is a habit that is taught and repeated in the school system as obeisance or obedience to authority figures like doctors, lawyers, and teachers. Now, to get an example of how this misassociation works, let's go to wordnik.com. And the first thing that we're going to do is look up the definition of critical thinking. And this website has the standard definition that is used in nearly every school system, at least across the United States, but I would argue across the globe. And their definition of critical thinking is the application of logical principles, rigorous standards of evidence, and careful reasoning to the analysis and discussion of claims, beliefs, and issues. Now, when you look at the definition, there's one thing that immediately pops out at you, and that is the word analysis, or at least it does me. Another thing that pops out is the fact that critical is the same word as critique, essentially. To critique something is the French version of critical, although I suspect there's a similar origin. Anyway, a critic, such as a food critic, their entire job is to criticize. And to criticize something means to point out the negative, or at least it has become in traditional practice, and then practical and traditional definition is, in fact, what they're working with here. So, with the habit of using the word critical in a certain way, and then misassociating this definition with critical thinking, they are instigating a very specific tactic that has to do with control of habit, and that has to do with association, word association. So if you ever remember those games where you have to, and they of course still do this stuff in the school system, you drag and drop a definition with a word. And your teacher will mark you down with whether or not you actually associated a word with the correct definition. And in that single moment, they gain control over where you associate definitions and words in your conscious. However, when it comes to your subconscious, if you believe that a certain definition associates with a word, but then over time you start encountering repeated uses of this word in a different context, well, your subconscious will move that word over to a different definition, and then will correctly associate the practical definition with the word itself. And in this sense, what they have as their definition of critical thinking is actually analytical thinking. Now, if we go to analytical thinking, this website, it will state there are no definitions. Well, the reason why there's no definitions is because the definition for analytical thinking is positioned under the word critical thinking. And the reason why they do this, by the way, is very simple. People that come out of the school system don't think, they criticize. Mostly, unless there's some other outside influence, mostly, if they're left in the incubative system of education, a person will come out and criticize immediately before thinking, versus thinking first and then criticizing. And that's why the criticisms are usually regurgitated, constantly canned responses. So if you're saying something, a lot of people that come out of the school system might criticize what you're saying based off of the sound of a word, or possibly in associating with some sort of sexual connotation. And in that sense, they're attempting to criticize what you're doing without thought, mind you. And that's the reason why it turns out the way it is. That is entirely and intentionally embedded in the school system through misassociation. Now what we can do is we can go to the definition of analysis. And even their definition of analysis is ridiculous. If we take, for example, the military analyst, a military analyst's job is, in fact, the definition of critical thinking. But they're not called critical military critics. They're not there to criticize the military. No, they're there to analyze things for the military, hence why they're called military analysts, not military critics. And a military analyst will compile a report of information that's gathered from different sources that in the attempt to generate a practical and actionable, demonstrated, informative brief over what needs to be done in a particular situation and what is that current situation. Now, you can have mistakes, but if you do it properly, you'll lower the mistakes through corroborated evidence and other things to do your job right. And that is, in fact, the definition they're presenting here of critical thinking. Now, what happens is when they conflate these terms and a person grows up, that person will have the definition of critical thinking as analytical thinking. However, in practice, they'll notice over repeated instances, and it becomes correctly maneuvered in the subconscious, that analysis is the definition of critical thinking, so they'll move that under analysis, and then to criticize will be moved under critical thinking. And because the school system puts so much importance on critical thinking and completely ignores the word analytical thinking and analysis, that will become prominent in their mind, and analysis will not be. Analysis is, in fact, the practical application of thought. That's a really good way to analyze that word. You're thinking about it, you're analyzing, you're looking at all the angles and all these other things. You are, in fact, doing what their definition of critical thinking is. Now, if we go to the definition of analysis, we find another subversive definition where they have incorrectly defined it and used other definitions that come from other words. For instance, one of their definitions is the separation of an intellectual material whole into its constituent parts for individual study. That's not analysis. That is categorizing. Now, it does not say category because whoever put this definition in here knows, likely, that this is the definition for categorizing, because when you categorize something, you break it down into different parts and put it into subcategories. And then the next one is the study of such constituent parts and their interrelationships in making up a whole. Well, I'm not even going to bother with that. They're clearly trying to make sure that the word analysis is difficult to understand because they use complicated wording intentionally made difficult to understand. And this comes from the American Heritage Dictionary of the English 5th edition. Yet another example of revisionism. But the point here is that this is a very understood and practical strategy and tactic that they are implementing here. And they're doing this with the intent to damage people's perception and ability to think. And this could be considered sabotage in many ways, but it also has the objective of establishing a pattern in opponents. And that way they can catch that opponent off guard. In this context, every single student in the education system is an opponent of the teacher. That's why teachers always react harshly to students that challenge their authority, because they're looking at an opponent in a fight. And in that context, you have to look at them as an opponent in a fight, and you can just as easily do the same things that they do at everyone else against them by embedding repetition and misassociating words on purpose. There is no reason why that tactic cannot be used. They would teach that it is, in fact, dishonest to use, and in some ways it probably is. However, they are using it currently, and they're still doing it. And the best way to combat it is to fight fire with fire, as they say. If you are in a boxing match and you set up this repetition pattern, nobody would say that it is being dishonest. And the reason for that is because you're in a fight, and the purpose of that fight is to win. If you ascribe to the idea that using these tactics is dishonest, then you would be the equivalent of a boxer who's facing another boxer, and you would refuse to use tactics you believe to be dishonest, and you would of course lose, especially to an opponent who might be equal in technique, but establishes that pattern of repetition, controls your subconscious, and then knocks you out. It is simply a tactic to be used in a fight, and appropriately. Now, if you don't understand how the tactic works, and you don't understand how to associate or misassociate, and you don't understand how to establish a pattern of repetition, cadence, and all these other things that you can find in music and pretty much every area of life, well, then you won't use it right and you won't be effective. So, not only is understanding technique important, understanding oneself is equally important, and understanding how thought functions is also important. All of these things that have been established in an effort to control us were made by people who were intentionally doing this and knew exactly what they were doing and how to do these things. It's just like every boxer wants to learn to be a better boxer, and every military analyst wants to learn to be a better military analyst, and every teacher wants to learn to be a better trainer, because what they do is not teach. They train. And they train specifically with the purpose of engaging an opponent and weakening that opponent, and that is the student, believe it or not. The students are the opponents of the teacher, and the students are the opponents of the corrupt. Because when students become wise, they realize that the corrupt and the people in authority and all these other people that prescribe to control them have no practical ability and are not deserving of the positions that they're in. And when students come to realize this, if they are ignorant, they're much easier to contend with. So they want to at least keep students ignorant, if nothing else, because that way they don't know how to fight back. And that, in a nutshell, is the idea of repetition and association. Now, in the next video, we will be covering 3 words, and those are upholding, binding, and thought. So don't go anywhere. If you like this content, like it, share it, subscribe, and of course, as always, stay thoughtful.